Welcome to Module 1, Unit 1 of the 16 to 19 funding training by Pro 16 Plus. First of all, we'll look at the background to how the formula came about. This section, we're looking at the whole philosophy and how the formula came about, what sits behind it, and why it works in the way that it does. So the background is that in around 2010, there was a change in approach, a feeling that the previous system was too complex, not delivering what was needed, and effectively costing too much. This was at the time of the coalition when austerity was at the top of the agenda. So the costing too much was a driver of change. The sort of people that were sitting behind this change were Michael Gove as the minister, the advisor were Dominic Cummings and Sam Friedman, and there was an external report by Professor Wolf, which looked into the way that the post-16 system was working. The whole philosophy around funding, which came about from the discussions between Gove, Cummings and Friedman, was that we needed a data-driven system which accurately delivered a level of funding which reflected the historical recruitment and delivery of the institution. Effectively, you were getting funded for what you delivered. But the approach was that it needed to be a simpler methodology of dealing with it rather than the previous extremely complicated one which was student focused rather than focused on building up a load of qualifications which weren't necessarily linked together, and that it would in effect reduce costs. So that the formula was designed to actually reduce the overall level of funding, and in many ways this level of funding has never been restored since around 2010 when the coalition came into power. So the basic philosophy is that the process should be as simple as possible and as complex as necessary. In fact, they were the first words that were spoken around it. It should be based on the latest complete data, which is how the lagged funding methodology comes into place. Be based on holistic program of what a learner was studying as a whole, not individual aims, and that came from the Wolf Review. And then the balance point on this was that it should be adaptable to policy change, because there was a recognition that the whole 16 to 19 landscape would change and the formula would need to be in existence for some time and therefore be capable of being adjusted and changing as we went along. So let's go through these key concepts. As simple as possible, as complex as necessary. There's a recognition that there is a degree of complexity, but the idea was to make it as simple as possible within the other overall philosophical areas. It would be a system which rewarded recruitment, completion, and complexity of learning. So that's the subject and the student that was in place there. Everything around the subject and the student, it should be reflective of the cost of delivery to some extent. A system looking at delivering a holistic program, not a collection of aims. So this is where the concept of a program of study came about. Prior to that, we'd only ever really looked at aims and putting aims together without them being thought of as a program of study. The need to be data-driven meant there would always be a degree of lag within the system, and we will go into how the lag works later on, and that the system must be flexible and adaptive. They already knew that they wanted to bring in English and maths condition of funding, so they needed to have a mechanism that could enable that to be put in place. There was a recognition that there was going to be a move away from AS and A2 to a linear A-level system. So again, flexibility and adaptivity needed to be available within the system. The previous system was a collection of aims that were funded based on the aim, and it was topped up by an enrichment when you reached a certain level of aims that were being funded. And then there was a cap at a certain level beyond which you couldn't be funded. And you're funded on the basis of what were known as standard learner numbers. there was a feeling that in some sectors, particularly in the private provider network, this system was exploited, and lots of low value qualifications were placed on the learner to generate cash for the provider rather than generate learning outcomes for the student. And a lot of money was being paid for a lot of qualifications which were adding no value to the student's ability to develop and learn and move into work. So the system didn't work from that point of view. And the idea was that if we moved into a program where there was a core aim, a core substantial aim, whether that be an A level or a series of A levels or a large vocational program, that there would be something substantial that the program was built around, and funding will be rewarded against substantial aims, not a series of small aims. The Woolf Review of 2011 was produced by Alison Wolf. It was mainly focused on vocational aims. And the idea was that we came out with a cohesive program of study for a program with a substantial aim at the core of it. And the recommendation was that students who failed GCSE English Maths at 16 should be required to redo them as part of their post-16 study program. So there is the link if you want to go dive deeper into the Wolf report. But that was the starting point of how the funding formula began to develop, and this underpinned how the formula was being put together. There was a consultation on it, and I think the extract from the consultation here is quite enlightening. What they were looking for, to be clear and transparent, as few basic elements as possible. So this is how the boxes came across. They were the basic element. The funding boxes were as few as possible. There was recognition that as we had changes, as new priorities came about, additional boxes may need to be added. Enable data simplification. So using wherever possible existing data that was collected rather than having to collect new data. In fairness, there were some new data elements that were needed, so they had to be put in place in the census. So there's a little bit of a lag time in developing that, but it was recognizing what was already there, what was needed, and minimizing the additional data collection requirements. That it should be fair, a fair system, so that regardless of what type of provider you were using the same system, and funding was distributed in an equal manner using the same processes and the same elements of the formula. It was also identified that there was a need to clearly show what element of the funding was related to disadvantage. So that was why the separate disadvantage box came about. And although I don't think it's really been done as anticipated, one of the ideas was that when Ofsted inspected, they would talk about how disadvantage was being tackled, how that amount of disadvantage money was being spent to support those learners and improve their outcomes. That's never really been taken on board, has almost been pushed onto the sidelines. And the final element was to avoid financially destabilizing good quality provision. So there was a need to not have a shake-up which would have massive impacts and cause funding changes which the school or provider was unable to cope with because of the change in the nature of the process. So that there was a recognition that the formula would have to be fed in over some time with some what were called cushioning and dampening measures to mean that you either didn't get a huge amount of additional money, or the reduction in funding was phased in over a few years, so you had time to plan and adapt your systems and staffing levels to meet the changes that were put in place. That was the basis of the consultation. As I said, I was quite heavily involved in the consultation process and was part of a specialist working group that looked into how the whole funding formula was developed and what sat behind it. this element here, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things which I call the smoke and mirrors of that. Although the basic funding rate was increased, the reduction in maximum hours meant that the level of funding dropped. In theory, under the previous system, you could be funded up to around 740 hours, whereas under this system, it was 600 hours. So effectively, the equivalent of an A-level subject's worth of annual funding was removed. EMA bursary was ended. EMA was ended, and a bursary system was put in place, which replaced that and reduced the overall costs. With rather than a nationally led and nationally administered support system for disadvantaged learners, it was going to be the duty of the institution to develop its own policy and put in place measures and actually distribute the bursary by what the school sees as the needs of the learner, rather than a top-down approach. So this was more a localism and greater degree of freedom, but you had much less money to deal with. So this is my thoughts of what happened with the system, that it's a mechanism to shift the emphasis to delivering holistic programs while reducing substantially the overall cost of the Treasury. And it was done through a mechanism that was not easily recognised by non-experts. It looked as if changes were not significant, but they actually had major funding implications at the very end of it. It was actually only when, after the processes were put in place, it was recognised that the amount of monies that would be allocated to each element meant that there would be this substantial reduction in funding overall, which had to be managed. And this slide gives a little bit of idea of what happened. Over the period of 2010-11 to 18-19, when the system was fully embedded, we had a real term 16% drop at student level of funding. And in school sixth forms, it actually was nearer a 26% fall overall, because many schools did high volume delivery, which was well rewarded in the old system and not so well rewarded here. So school sixth forms did face particular pressure. There was a need to reduce funding. There was a need to adjust the system, but I believe it did go too far, and it has damaged particularly the school sixth form sector, and has made you very focused on what particular funding learners attract, what are the funding risks. I presume that was one of the hidden things which Treasury officials who were present at most of the big meetings wanted to put in place. So this is the original formula. This is what it looked like when we first started discussing it. And it, as you can see, when we look at simplification, it is a very simple process, a series of boxes. Everything is processed within boxes, and some things that are processed behind the boxes to get to the total program funding. It's almost unrecognizable to what we see now. We knew that there were going to be changes put in place because, as we've already said, the English and Maths condition of funding was going to come in place. So we knew there would be a new element added to that. And we knew that there would need to be processes for that shift from the AS to the A2 model. So although the system was there, it was recognized that in the short term, there will be significant changes. But the idea was that the formula would be embedded initially, and then the changes would take place and we would adapt to the changes. And from data that was already being collected, it was possible to give an indication of what the impact of those changes would be and how working practices would have to adjust to avoid the financial penalty of condition of funding deductions or work with an ASA2 model. There were some things that weren't fully thought out and took a lot of arguing to get YPLA as it was then, ESFA as it it was later, and DFE has been the overall body in charge. It's taken time to get them to recognise the impact of what they were doing, because their focus wasn't on the practicalities at time, and sometimes it's taken people who are at the coalface, if you like, to highlight to them that actually this won't work in this way. You need to make this change, or you need to make this adjustment, or you need to make this allowance to make it work, or you need this relaxation in place to take account of X, Y, and Z. And we will talk about some of those as we go through this process of looking at the funding formula. So this is where we are now, and as you can see, there are a lot more boxes in there. Some of the things are very much the same: the student number, the funding rate, the retention, program cost weighting. English and maths funding is new. Disadvantage funding is still there in place. And then we have condition of funding adjustment, advanced maths premium, core maths premium, HVCP, and you see in there T levels. We're going to cover that in a separate module completely, because although T levels works within the formula, it is managed and run in a completely different way. And if you try and do your T level analysis of funding in the same way as your 16 to 19, you will go horrendously wrong, because you have to record data in a completely different way to ensure you're meeting the T level requirements. So T level will be looked at separately. In the main, we will be looking at 16 to 19, which is the majority of the funding that you were receiving. So some final thoughts on this module 1. The philosophy and the basic concepts have proved to be robust. They've been in place now well over 10 years. And the policy has been able to respond to the policy changes, and by that creation of new boxes and the development of new processes, either within the boxes or operating behind the boxes to give figures. The formula did deliver that required significant per pupil reduction in funding, and that has not been recovered in the last decade. And this is the reason that many sixth forms are under significant financial pressure. That's the end of Module 1, Unit 1, and that covers what we are looking at there in terms of the overall philosophy of the funding formula, how it came into being, and effectively that is the why it was in place. We will take a look in detail in the next unit around the formula and its development, as we delve a little bit deeper into how this works. So we will see you through Unit 2 later.